Guruve Gaurachandraya Radhikaya Tadale Krishnaya Krishna Bhaktaya Tadabhaktaya Namo Namaha Vancha Kalpatrubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhaivacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasari Shri Gaura Bhaktavinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Haribol devotees, good afternoon. I am back to trying to be consistent with answering questions. And the questions have been pretty diverse. I mean, yesterday one devotee had written, well, actually he didn't write yesterday, but it was, I think day before yesterday, but I answered the question yesterday. And it was in regards to Radha Tattva. In actuality, he was asking more or less, Krishna is the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Why is so much emphasis given to Srimati Radharani? That I know she's the greatest devotee. So then I tried to give some explanation about Radha Tattva without going too elaborately, and to give some perspective on why the worship of Srimati Radharani is so paramount to those who aspire to serve, especially if you aspire to serve Krishna in Braj. So today's question from last night is completely on another polarity, and it involves the position of devotees and prepping. So let me say that it was a family who wrote. They live out the Midwest, so that much I was allowed to say. I never, of course, reveal identities or anything like that, but they live in the Midwest. And they were saying pretty much they were surprised at the lack of devotees' preparation for the possibility of adverse effects in the society. And they wanted to know if there was some either scriptural or philosophical reason why devotees do not take heed to, I guess, prepping for social catastrophes, etc., etc. So, of course, that was a little bit of paraphrasing. They wrote a very pretty long thing. And that's another thing. I'm not sure why when people ask a question, and I'm not opposed to it at all, because obviously people want to give some background and context to what they're asking. So, but a lot of the recent ones have been pretty long. But I thought this particular couple, and again, I think one is an initiated devotee. I'm not sure the wife is an initiated devotee, but she's been around Krishna consciousness for some time, according to other things I've read in the question. But the major thing is, I thought it was a reasonable topic to discuss. I do remember, again, I think I brought this up previously, that once my Guru Parapadma, Nityalila Pravishtam Vishnupada Paramahansa Astotar Sutta Sisimat Srila Bhaktivedanta Narayan Goswami Maharaj, he was asked about preparation for Y2K. And if anybody can remember back to the period when we were transitioning over, and there was a lot of doubt about the effectiveness of how the transition would go, and various other considerations, and people were storing food and water and this and that, and etc., etc. So anyway, one devotee asked my Guru Parapadma directly how we should prepare for this sort of event. And my Guru Maharaj, and I've repeated this on several occasions, I believe, he mentioned that one should be prudent and chant Hare Krishna. So I've explained many times before as well, and in different circumstances and under different questions and conversations, that prudence is not adverse to being devoted to God. I've never read anywhere sastrically or in our theological composition anywhere where it's mentioned that prudence is adverse to bhakti. In fact, even in the crux issue of Saranagati, the statement that one should Rakshishiti Goptrave Varanam Tata, that one should be completely dependent for the Lord for both their protection and their maintenance, that's still not adverse to using prudence in regard to things related to our welfare, because intelligence is also given by Bhagavan. So it is not that the use of prudence in regard to personal, family, or even community dealings is somehow adverse to bhakti. So that was the first thing that I wrote back, because I am replying to the question online. I did not write back elaborately, but I did write back that much, that no, there is no scriptural or theological consideration that the application of being prudent and the application of being prepared for possible natural disasters, social unrest or upheavals, things like a pandemic or any of these kind of things, there's not any Vaishnav prohibition against preparing for such things. In fact, it is being prudent. So the question is, how do we balance that scale? I do know people, even personally, who prepping is a religion for them. They actually, their day-to-day meditation is what new thing to get to add to the stockpile of everything they need in terms of food, medicine, farming, equipment, etc., etc. So there are, overabsorption, if that's a good way to couch it, in such things, and then there's prudence. So where does prudence lie in this whole spectrum? So prudence is doing those things, analyzing the circumstances that would be needful to help yourself and family and community in the event of a natural disaster, any kind of calamity, social unrest, any kind of shortages or anything. So obviously some of the ways to do that is to plan ahead a number of things. One is, obviously, there's some basic needs that everyone has just based on their existence in the material world. Food, shelter, obviously some access to water, and, some way to defend those things that you have and that you need for your existence, and some way to appropriately deal with medical issues, both acute medical issues as well as, general health things. So I think if one took those categories, food, shelter, medical preparation, defensive preparations, and water preparations, because water is so integral to everything, then I think that's a show of prudence. Now, it could happen in a number of different ways. It could happen by individual family preparation. I've also said that this is something that should be considered and should be done. It could happen on a more communal level. If you live in a community in which you can reach out to other people and say, hey, this is a good idea for us to plan how to, as a community, be prepared for everything from natural disasters to, things like a pandemic and et cetera, et cetera. So another way is establish communities which have more natural facility to accommodate the things that you would need. So especially speaking in our Vaishnav community, there are some temples and communities which are rule-based, which if they were supported by even those who are urban dwelling devotees, could be a recourse if you needed to go somewhere and be able to facilitate the things we just talked about. So one way to do that would be to make some kind of pact or agreement with a community which is closest to you to contribute to the development of a contingency plan to get out of the city. Al Srila Prabhupada was very clear that especially urban living would be difficult under circumstances of duress, and especially in the Kali Yuga. These things will happen more frequently. So because urban dwelling is pretty difficult to accommodate all of these things, like food, shelter, etc., then making a pact with a rural community where you can go if there's hint of an emergency and take shelter there. Now, obviously, you do want some kind of pact, and you do want to be a contributor to helping that community, because one thing that happens in emergency situations is the overloading of facilities. So if everyone suddenly packed up and said, oh, we got to get out of the city, and everybody runs to a rural community, we have to think about the impact in terms of persons, resources, etc. on that community. So it would not be prudent to just, expect that, well, if I get into difficulty, I'm just going to run up to one of the rural communities and take shelter there. Because how will that community, based on its own current population, be able to accommodate a sudden surge in the population based on, devotees who didn't plan, so to speak, and then they suddenly, flock to one of the communities. So that's why I'm giving the idea to make a social pact with a rural community and contribute on an ongoing basis to the development of that. Now, you could make a committee to oversee that, and you could work together with that community to oversee the storage of food, etc., and the other things that we talked about. And, therefore you have some recourse. Now, one thing should be noted is that once a disaster takes place, a lot of times there's not a expanded period of time which you have to make decisions to go or leave, etc. Sometimes things happen so fast. We've seen tornadoes, other natural disasters, or sometimes social unrest issues and other things happen so quickly that you may not be able to get out of your circumstance. Therefore, one thing should be is probably devotees who are not exclusively and inextricably tied to an urban environment. You should start planning now to try to find a more rural environment for your future living. It's just that in the Kali Yuga, it's been predicted in the 12th canto Bhagavatam that certain things would happen, and when these things happen, the cities would be the most difficult, most dangerous, most ineffective places to carry out sustaining yourself and your family in conditions of an emergency. So you should plan long-term or short-term, depending on how old you are, to try to situate yourself in an environment which will be more conducive both to your bhajan life and to the functional issues of living, right? So that's another consideration. The long-term plan, an emergency plan, and realization that in an emergency, things may not be as easy in terms of traversing out of the city at a time when there's an emergency going on. I mean, you take someplace like Los Angeles or Chicago, New York, or anything where you just have so many people there, right? And even cities in other places, and suddenly you need to evacuate from that place. We've seen it in natural disasters where you'll see, hours and hours long lines of traffic just to get out of that particular city. So, these are some of the things you might want to consider. You might want to consider even having a route plan where you have alternative routes, where you've mapped out ways to accomplish. I'm not trying to cover every kind of planning contingency here. I'm really basically answering a question. But in answering that question, I'm giving some examples. So that's one thing. Second thing is, even individually as devotees, in your personal life, or if you have a family, in your family life, you should plan how to do things which are prudent to helping you survive situations of natural disasters and other sort of things. Some things are you can't. Sometimes a tornado will come, and what's the survival of that? Pretty much. But you can make some kind of preparation, right? There are other kinds of disasters and situations which prudent planning as a family will be helpful. So why not take the time to sit down as a family and say, listen, here's the things: food, shelter, water, some ability to protect yourself. And so why not sit down, make a plan like that? The health concerns and medical concerns, especially as we're we're aging, we may have particular health concerns, so forth, that need to be addressed. So how do we deal with that? So just sit down and make a plan, a contingency. Here's the best way for us to operate in the event of an emergency of any sort. Certainly, one thing that's even being publicly talked about now is food shortages. So is there any contingency for having a recourse to growing food or storing food, or except, I mean, these are just practical, day-to-day, mature, prudent things to consider. So I think the devotee's question was really apropos. I think it was also pretty timely because there are, we have witnessed things like the civil unrest we witnessed throughout last year. I mean, that's a pretty intense situation, especially if you lived in an urban area and you could not easily get, access in and out of your apartment if you lived in an apartment. Or perhaps the streets were too dangerous to be out and about, So, and then also, with the situation with stores, maybe a lot of stores are shut down during that time. So, I mean, it's just, when you think about it, it's not some very deep, over the top, the world's coming to an end, rah, rah, rah sort of thing. It's just a common sense, yes, sit down, be prudent, make a plan. And then my Guru Maharaj said, chant Hare Krishna. Because in the long run, everything is in the hands of Bhagwan. There is no circumventing that fact. But the lack of prudence, you can't conflate those two things. Well, I'll just depend on Krishna. Well, part of dependence on Krishna is using the intelligence that Krishna gave you to be prudent. And hearing that from the mouth of a pure Vaishnava, be prudent and chant Hare Krishna. He could have just said, just chant Hare Krishna. Be prudent and chant Hare Krishna. So we need to take those things into consideration. I do probably believe that there are a number of devotees, maybe it's just not very publicized or anything, that do take prudent measures of how they'll take care of their family or maybe community in the event of any kind of emergency circumstance. So I don't know if devotees have a forum somewhere for that sort of thing or not, but I'm sure there are some devotees who are being pragmatic as far as these things are concerned and are acting accordingly. So, but if you haven't, then I think the devotee writing me, and I didn't see I didn't do a lot of research on the page of that devotee. They actually have a website as well, so I don't have any permission to give out any of that kind of information, and I'm probably not at any rate, because like I said, I didn't want to get into a habit of getting questions and then talking about who it is unless they specifically ask me to do that. But I think if you do go online or go on some devotee forums, you could just check and see if there's any forums where devotees are discussing these things. And if you're not familiar with how to do these things, then perhaps there's some information there that'll be helpful and in your development of beginning to develop these things for yourself, your family, or community, if you have an extended community you're part of, etc. Of course, each component that I talked about has its own unique features. If you're going to deal with food and food supplies, you need to make sure you have adequate time to grow food, and you need to figure out what the schedule is for how crops come and go. So, it's not just a case of, well, I'll always have food because I have the capacity to grow it, but it's actually the timetable, because in an emergency, you may not be able to work in your garden the same way you do in a normal circumstance. So if you do food storage, then you need to figure out those kind of things, and how do you facilitate that in your house, because everybody's house and their size of the houses, etc., are different. So all those considerations need to be, if you're talking about self-defense things, then you need to, first of all, deal with the law. You need to understand what the laws are and wherever you live regarding those things, and you understand them completely. If you especially talk about any kind of firearms issues or anything, then you certainly need to have training when it comes to that. If you talk about health and medical issues, then you need to know your own unique circumstances. You need to even talk to your family physician if you have one. If you're somebody who deals with more homeopathic and holistic care, You need to map out, well, how will this work in the case of acute medical issues and so forth? Do I still need to try to have contact with a primary care physician or something to get certain kinds of medicines that are especially meant for, acute problems and so forth? So there's just quite a few things to consider. There are quite a few things to consider, quite a few things to consider, all said and done when we start talking about these things. Even having knowledge of basic first aid and those sort of things, I think is also apropos. Anyway, I'm not going to belabor this, and I'm getting a call letting me know that I have some other things to do. So hopefully this was helpful, and certainly I think it's a pertinent part of living as a devotee, because sometimes we tend to separate the theological, philosophical issues from the pragmatic issues, and we shouldn't do that. The actual definition of yukta vairagya is renunciation with appropriate dealings with the material atmosphere. Okay? All right, so let me end everything here. Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Nityananda Shri Gadara Sri Gaur Bhaktivinoda. Hare Krishna 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 Hare Hare, Hare Ram 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 Hare Hare. Jai Radhe Radhe.